My name is John Lentz. I'm the managing editor at City and State. I'll be moderating our next panel. The discussion for this panel will be the role of states and the courts in addressing municipal finance issues. And we have three great panelists with us today. To my right, Robert Ward, a deputy controller for New York State. To his right, Mark Shaw, who's now with CUNY but has extensive budget experience at the city and the state level. And to his right, Mark Kaufman of McKenna Long, one of the country's top experts on municipal finance and bankruptcy. And you can read more about their bios in the program. But to start it off, Mr. Ward, could you just give us a briefing on the Comptroller's new distressed municipalities list that came out this week and what impact that could have?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And I should start by, on behalf of Comptroller DiNapoli, thanking the previous panel for their kind comments about the Comptroller's new fiscal stress monitoring system. And I'll also mention that I happen to have started my career as a newspaper reporter with an afternoon newspaper in the city of Albany that unfortunately is no longer publishing, the Knickerbocker News. But among the municipalities that I covered was the town of Colony. And being a fresh-faced young reporter, I really didn't know much about municipal budgets and probably struggled a little bit to explain to the readers what exactly was going on with the town of Colony's budget. Well, now, on the list of fiscally stressed municipalities that the Comptroller issued 2 days ago, it so happens that the town of Colony is one of the 6 jurisdictions in the state that is at the top of the list as unfortunately being in significant fiscal stress. And I know that if I were a young reporter today, I would be easily capable of writing up that story and giving the citizens of the town of Colony some idea of what was going on with their municipal budget. So that's really the idea behind the fiscal stress monitoring system. It takes a variety of data that most people would never see and would not know what to make of if they did. Things like the fund balance, the operating deficit, the cash position, use of short-term debt, and fixed costs, which include employee compensation and debt service. It takes all of those metrics and it rolls them up into one number, which makes it pretty easy for folks to understand that. So that even a young reporter or a typical homeowner or business person, or dare I say even maybe some local officials who may not understand the full range of complexities about local budgets are able to get a very clear sense of where their jurisdiction stands relative to others. And equally important, over time, each municipality will have a sense of whether its position is getting better or worse compared to where it was the previous year. So this is something that the Comptroller asked the staff to start working on almost a year ago now. It was assembled over the course of many months, including some time for consultation with municipal officials, budget directors, and treasurers, and so on to lend advice. And so we believe that what we have is a very well-balanced and well-designed, factual basis for, again, not only local elected officials, but importantly for citizens to get a clear picture of the financial condition of their local government. And of course, all of this circles back to what Dick Ravitch said in his opening remarks, which is that fiscal stress rolls downhill. And so the fiscal stress monitoring system really provides a picture of what is going on at the bottom of the hill. And the hope is that local officials will use this as a tool. And again, some of the officials who were on the prior panel said that they expect to do this. Use it as a tool to help their fellow elected officials and citizens understand the reality of what they are facing. And again, help citizens understand that reality so that they can really participate actively in the discussion, which I think is something that tends not to happen, and given the difficult decisions that are going to have to be made, really needs to happen. So the Comptroller sees this as a great educational tool that we hope will lead to a better discussion, better debate, and thus better outcomes.
Now, reading through the report, it becomes clear that New York City is a relative bright spot in the state, but it wasn't always that way. I'm wondering, Mr. Shaw, could you tell us some about the history of New York City and what lessons its financial problems in the past have for us today?
One of the lessons I think that people need to learn, and it was interesting to listen to the earlier panel because it actually does work and has been working, is not to make the mistakes that have already occurred before and to learn from the past. And one of the things that's unique here in New York State is New York City had a really, really bad fiscal crisis in the mid-70s, and it, laid off tens of thousands of municipal workers. The subway system was a wreck, and a control board was put in effect and helped New York City climb out of the problems that occurred at the time. And one of the lessons is to not repeat the actions of letting things fall to the point where you need a control board and a control period, because it really takes power away from the local elected officials who are best able to figure out what needs to be done. But one of the positive things that came out of the fiscal crisis was the concept of not looking at budgets on an annual basis, but to do more long-term planning. And it was from the fiscal crisis that the state pushed on the city, but allowed the city to first create what was a 3-year plan and then became a 4-year rolling fiscal plan. And one of the reasons why it's so important is it allows one to look at the long-term consequences of the decisions the one's making, to look at what the driving forces are that are causing the structural budget problem so that you can have a more intelligent debate about what needs to be done to solve those problems. And then what it does is it allows the budgeting process that happens on an annual basis, or in New York City's case, it actually now exists on a quarterly basis. Even though there's an annual budget, it's reviewed and adjusted on a quarterly basis. The budgetary decisions that are made get to be made in the context of what the longer-term consequences are. And it leads to a more intelligent debate. It allows one to start to come up with more creative solutions of how to get from here to there. And I think it's been valuable to New York City's comeback. And it's nice to hear some of the other municipalities are starting to take it to be normal that you should think in terms of fiscal plan, because I think it changes the whole debate about the budget.
Now, part of the context here is not just looking back in time, but looking now across the country. Mr. Kaufman, could you tell us a little bit about the perspective you have with places like Stockton, California, and what's happening there, and how that could impact New York and municipalities here?
Sure. I think the dynamic in looking at how other states and cities in other states are dealing with the distress is more than just anecdotal. It's going to be, in my view, sort of a wave of where the future is going to be, because the dynamics that create the problem, whether it's Stockton or San Bernardino or worse still, Detroit, you have all the inherent problems that the panel before us spoke of. High amount of obligations for pension, some of which are underfunded, the OPEB problem, which is not funded at all, union contracts that are high, and in a large respect, too much bond indebtedness that was used to plug a lot of dikes in the past. And the consequence of all of that, when coupled with shrinking property tax base and the shrink of federal funding that Mr. Ravitch talked about earlier, plague all these cities. And so it's endemic, and it's part of the landscape we find. So when you look at Stockton and you say, what's going on there? It is not an isolated event that's unique and specific to Stockton, where the only people that are looking at it are Stockton or nearby and the politicians there. Every monoline insurer who's involved in financing or backing, credit enhancing the bonds all around the country are riveted to that situation. Every union that's out there, whether it's the Fraternal Order of Police or the firefighters or AFSCME or any of the other public unions, are out there saying what's going to happen there. Pension plans, even though that's CalPERS out there, other pension plans and retiree groups are looking at the situation, because what's going to happen in Stockton, there's either going to be a resolution by consent, or there's going to be a resolution with litigation and ultimately a bankruptcy court decision. either way, it's a bellwether. I don't see the circumstance where whatever happens in Stockton stays in Stockton. It is going to have profound implications, San Bernardino, and then other cities in California, because if Stockton can get a markdown, which is inevitably necessary, they're not going to be able to have a material tax your way out solution to the problem. Other things that we've talked about earlier in terms of consolidation and efficiencies, they're all important and they're necessary. A number of the mayors talked about how they've already done a lot of, and the county executives, about what they've already done before they even reached the crisis. And so those issues are not going to drive the resolution. The resolution is going to have to be getting the major constituents in around a table and saying, how is the concession going to be affected and who's going to share in it and to what extent? And whatever happens in one of those places is then going to be a marker for how other cities see it. And that's going to ripple not only through California, but I believe in any of the industrial states that have a heavy union concentration where the same dynamics exist.
Do you think we could have a Stockton in New York?
Well, by that, you mean could there be a bankruptcy? Well, first of all, let me just say this. Best done, nobody, whether you're an insolvency professional, as a financial advisor or a lawyer or whatever, sees bankruptcy as the answer. That's a last resort. What you need is the bankruptcy threat. So the whole notion is, why would anybody sit at the table and say, I'm ready to make concessions, unless you have an offer and then a stick in your hand to say something worse can happen. If you don't have that dynamic, and half the states, by the way, don't have bankruptcy as an option, then there's no dialogue that can really be had. And if you have limitations on the ability to use bankruptcy as a vehicle, then you're not going to really be able to get to a robust discussion to resolve. So whether it's bankruptcy or a consensual out of court, which is much more ideal, it's efficient, it's time constraining, and it's certain in its result rather than doing bankruptcy. So I've never been an exponent of bankruptcy as a solution. But the question of whether or not cities are going to have to go through that kind of dialogue, it's inevitable. You listened to the first panel before. You can nice it up and say we have to work cooperatively. What really is being said is there are going to be needs for the unions and the retirees and the bondholder or the monoline insurers of those bondholders to sit with city officials and work it out. The state's not going to fund the shortfall, and there's no other mechanism of efficiencies that's going to get to the requisite need to get the budget balanced. And mayors who are in a position who wanted to deal with this now rather than waiting to the 11th hour crisis are exactly right. There's no sense of waiting to Armageddon and a forced bankruptcy because you're out of money. Have a dialogue earlier and in enough time to avert it and turn the card. And I think when you see Stockton or San Bernardino having a result, it's going to start rationalizing the process so that whatever creditor constituency, whether you're representing bondholders or you're representing the retirees or the unions, are going to understand that there's a set of parameters, unique perhaps for every city, but generally speaking, concessions having to be made. And once that starts, hopefully it'll be a normalized process so that it's not as unpolitical to talk about and get to the reality of fixing the cities, not with hope springs eternal that somehow something can work out, but actually sitting there and saying we got to have concessions in order to right-size the budget so that long-term we can have stable future for our city.
I'd like to add to that if I could, and very much agree with Mark that we need to have these conversations at a very serious level so that we do not get to the point where people even start thinking that bankruptcy is an option. Bankruptcy legally is an option in New York for municipalities. To our knowledge, there is no jurisdiction that is even giving that serious consideration, but we do have serious problems. The other point that's worth keeping in mind, the mayor of Rochester, Tom Richards, makes the point that before cities get to legal and financial bankruptcy, they encounter social and civic bankruptcy. And that is I believe, the much more widespread danger. And we have already seen significant reductions in services in many jurisdictions. Mark Shaw referred to what happened in the 1970s in New York when there were very dramatic service cutbacks. Again, I happen to live in the city of Albany. Just a little anecdote, when I go jogging, I see in many areas of the city, instead of taking up sidewalk that has been damaged by tree roots or what have you, the city will sort of shave off the edge of a piece of pavement, so that if you're in a wheelchair, you can negotiate those ups and downs in the sidewalk. If you're jogging and don't lift your feet up very much like me, you're less likely to trip. So these are the kind of half measures that are being taken with regard to services, in some cases more dramatic reductions, closing facilities, or some places around the country closing libraries and so on. So in addition to thinking about the long-term potential of bankruptcy and again, doing everything we can to avoid even getting close to that precipice, we need to think, I think, very seriously about what are we doing today to safeguard those services that are so essential in the cities and other municipalities.
And I think the good news here is that with all the problems New York State has and New York City has had in the past, you know, the fact that these things, we're talking about what's happening in Stockton, California, and, you know, the Ravitch Commission looked at, you know, other states that are in worse municipal stress than New York State, the classic example being Illinois in terms of its problems, New Jersey in terms of its pension problems. We're going to see these problems take place around the country, and, you know, while you're right that Stockton is something, you know, we're going to see as a test model, in many ways it's also serving the purpose of preventing it from happening in New York, because dialogues just like this are taking place here these days, and that's a really healthy thing. I mean, it sounds silly to talking about the fiscal distress of New York as a healthy thing, but sometimes you have to talk about the problems in order to better understand what the solutions are and have the debates that are necessary. And whether the debates end up being with regard to bondholders or labor unions, or, you know, the retirees and the healthcare issues that these municipalities are facing, those are all good things that are happening. And the fact those dialogues are taking place right now is going to prevent municipalities in New York State from ending up like Stockton.
But
Yeah,
would it?
I was going to say, I quite agree with that comment, because I think going through the process that Stockton is going through now, where everything is uncharted and unknown as to who gets hit, to what extent, how does it all balance, hopefully through that, one can say, well, that's scary because it invites other cities to do it. On the other hand, it also creates the notion that there's a set of parameters and a go-by as to how cities ought to do it, and it also makes something that otherwise has been sort of underneath the table, not wanting to be talked about, now a discourse that can be had, because the players have already made some concessions and they're open to do business. I can tell you that the monoline creditors who I deal with, I'm counsel for the receiver in Harrisburg, so we're dealing with those players. They're very concerned about what the optics are and what happens out in California, because it impacts all the other places they are. The same thing for the public unions, because they're in all the cities. So I think it's going to help shape the dialogue and make more efficient the process, rather than having everybody start from square one in every city without any kind of base of reference in terms of how this ought to equilibrate and who ought to share and to what extent.
Well, what is the state doing right then in New York? And you know, are there any things it should be doing that it's not doing right now to avoid getting to the, you know, where California is with the threat of bankruptcy?
Well, at the end of the day, what keeps a state or a municipal government from having those problems is having an economy that grows. And so, you know, that's sort of the key to keeping municipality out of fiscal distress. And, you know, the fact is that unlike 75, when New York City was going through this crisis, and New York State's government in general was relatively healthier, we now have the opposite impact. And so, you know, we have a city with all its warts and with all its fiscal problems is clearly much healthier than the rest of New York State is. And, you know, so what you see, it's, you know, at one level it's obvious, but it's why, you know, the current governor is so focused on coming up with proposals or ideas of how to get the economy of upstate New York going again. I mean, the truth of the matter is it's an economy that, you know, was based in manufacturing, that, you know, goes back to the manufacturing that was surrounding development of the Erie Canal, and it hasn't been able to get out of that rut that started 30, 40, and 50 years ago. And, you know, it's what the focus is now. And, you know, while I don't particularly have specific answers, I mean, just the fact that that debate is taking place is a really healthy thing.
I would echo that, certainly. When you look at Syracuse, Schenectady, Buffalo, other cities, in many, if not most cases, they have lost literally half of their population over the last half century. We're all pretty familiar with the decline of manufacturing jobs and other factors. So I think Mark is absolutely right. The idea or the understanding that this is in many ways at bottom an economic problem is not widely enough understood. Having said that, we're probably not going to turn around the economic fortunes of the upstate cities and upstate more generally within the next year or two, or even 5 or more. So we do need to think about the fiscal solutions as well. And Comptroller DiNapoli has said that in addition to, number one, understanding the problem more clearly, which is what the fiscal stress monitoring system is all about, we need to start thinking about a new agenda for cities, a new relationship between the state and its municipalities. And he has pointed out, for example, that in this year's budget and last year's budget, there were increases in funding for education, for health care, for most programs across the board. The state's general assistance for municipalities was held flat. So he makes the argument that over time, as the state resources continue to grow, there should be another look at what's known as the Aid and Incentives for Municipalities program. But again, that will only be one part of the solution. Clearly, both the state and local officials need to look at ways to get costs under control as well.
There's a few things Governor Andrew Cuomo has done this year. One, he had a pension smoothing proposal. I think the Comptroller's office modified that. There's this change to binding arbitration that'll take more into account a locality's ability to pay. There's this financial restructuring panel the governor is putting into place. What do you think will be the impact of these steps? I mean, is this enough? Should the state be doing more than that?
I think some of these steps will be helpful. In some cases, it's still, people are still figuring out what the role of the restructuring panel, for example, will be. I don't think that is well understood. We'll have to see how that plays out. That in itself depends on action by local elected officials to affirmatively come to the state and say, we would like to be part of this restructuring process that the panel would oversee. So, it will be a series of decisions by leaders in many hundreds of jurisdictions making the choice as to whether they think that could be helpful for them. I think it's fair to say that however that panel itself works out, there will be a lot of jurisdictions that do not avail themselves of that, and so we need a broad range of solutions. We have started to move toward that, but we still have a ways to go.
I would say that just focusing on how some other states have done it, it becomes iterative. You start a process. I think New York has started a process. You start with the recognition that there's distress and some initiatives are taken. Where it moves, I think, has become sort of the will of the people. At this juncture in New York, I think there's a recognition that there's a problem, but the pervasiveness and where the solutions lie and how you're going to get there are still being evaluated. And until you get to a sense that there are profound needs to make some moves and then a structure that supports that, you have to start someplace. So I think New York is starting, the dialogue is open, that's a constructive thing. And at some point, to refer to where Bob was just speaking, ultimately there has to be a mechanism where there is a fruitful and efficient means for cities to get involved in the process without fear, for taking the initiative and for wanting to get into the dialogue themselves, that they have the ability to do it with perhaps not the fear of a control board if they're wanting to be proactive and fiscally prudent in what they're wanting to do. And that's going to take some time to evolve, but hopefully that can happen. And the more there is dialogue at the state and programs developed by the state that enable cities to help fix themselves and to achieve a resolution, the more you avoid any bankruptcy and the more you smooth out the need to ultimately get to compromise, hopefully behind closed doors rather than litigation.
It seems like one of the common lessons is, you need to take action early. Don't put things off, don't kick the can down the road. Should New York do something like Wisconsin did and take drastic steps in terms of its relations with unions?
Well, I think part of the issue is understanding that it's a little more complex than, the press bite that you see in terms of, some of the issues, especially that have been going on with regard to labor unions around the states. And you need to understand that, number one, there aren't simple solutions, or they would have been done. It's not that government doesn't know how to do things. It's just that these are very complicated issues. And on the pension issue, which we've seen start to play in a number of states, part of the issue is understanding what those pension costs are and who both pays them and who are the beneficiaries of them. And in New York, it's not going to be this simple issue of, well, we need to cut back pension benefits of all retirees, or, step one is understanding what the costs are and what's causing them. The average retiree in of a civil servant in state government or city government today probably has a pension of $15,000 to $20,000 still. The costs of the pension system that are out of control right now are, in New York City as an example, of the uniform parts of the city government, which is police, fire, sanitation, and corrections. And there's a reason for it. The work those people do, they're heroes when they do their jobs, and everybody likes to feel good about your police officer providing safety, a fireman keeping the city from burning down. But the costs of providing that service are incredibly expensive, and it's a matter of understanding that. And what it, in New York City's case, what it's led to is a dialogue of how can we get the system to be more efficient for the costs of providing those kind of services. And that's where the politics takes place in terms of, the labor unions playing in Albany and forcing issues to keep the costs up in a certain way. And, in New York State, the number of men that ride a fire engine in New York City is actually mandated by state law. Obviously because of the power that the unions have had in terms of influence in Albany. And it's understanding those kind of issues to just begin to try to address the problem, to really look at pensions in New York State. And I think it's going to play out very differently than in places like Wisconsin.
It's also useful to look at the differences among classes of local governments. We heard from the panel earlier from both county and cities. We heard the same general observation that these problems are very real and we need to take a look at them. The nature of them, as Mark was saying, varies. Counties, of course, pay a significant share of Medicaid costs. The good news for them is that cost is being capped, and I think starting next year will be held flat going forward. That doesn't mean that they don't still have a significant chunk of their budgets tied up in a cost that is difficult for them to deal with, but at least over time, as their sales tax and property tax and other revenues go up, the Medicaid burden will, over time, gradually diminish. Then, on the other hand, as one of the county executives mentioned, they are paying more for parole services because of a change that the legislature made. So the legislature made that change at a time when the state was having its own very severe budget problems. Conceivably, that's something that could be changed going forward. But these are different concerns than the cities face. Most counties in the state do not have the same issues with police and fire costs, for example, that many of the cities have. So it's helpful to look at the different nature of these problems from one jurisdiction to another. And again, that gets back to trying to understand the problem in greater detail than we have before.
And on the earlier panel, the Syracuse mayor applauded the comptroller's list, said this is good, it's unpacking it a little bit. The Rensselaer County executive also said it was a good thing. However, in, I believe, Monroe County, the county executive there criticized it. She said, look, we're doing everything right. What we need to do is fix the mandates. So I'm wondering if you have any response to that criticism.
Well, the nature of this fiscal stress monitoring system is it's entirely data-driven. The numbers are provided to the controller's office by the municipality itself. So it's hard to argue with the numbers. Everyone is welcome to look at the methodology and decide for themselves whether we assign the proper weight to fund balance as opposed to cash position or employee compensation and those kinds of questions. But rather than argue with the criticism, I would simply say that it's a very good thing for these debates to be held, because the more that citizens hear these conversations, the more they will learn about it. Some of them might even go to the controller's website, look up the numbers for themselves, look at how their county or city or town compares to others, and perhaps reach some conclusions that they were not able to reach before. On the mandate issue, again, I think everyone agrees that over time it's appropriate for the state, which has a broader tax base, partly because of New York City, thank you, Mark, that it is appropriate for the state to make things easier for particularly hard-pressed municipalities by either taking back some of the costs that it has imposed on the localities, or providing more direct financial assistance, or taking other steps. But mandate relief is it's a very slippery concept and difficult to get at specifics.
I think to some extent, public opinion in the locale drives the willingness of parties to sit down and do something consensually they may not want to do. The experience recently in Harrisburg, by the way, just yesterday, the police voted for a concession that was out for vote as part of a comprehensive plan that we're in the hopefully final stages of putting together. That wouldn't have happened had there not been a lot of public discourse about the need for shared imposition or concessions by parties, or taking, viewed more positively, taking a leadership role in helping fix the problem. And unless you start engaging in a public discourse about the problems and getting the public opinion out there, then the constituencies are not going to be motivated. They may be motivated by the bankruptcy risk, for sure, but they're going to be motivated by the sense of public opinion, because at the end of the day, if there needs to be some belt tightening, and if the answer is not taxing the citizens more to avoid the fiscal imbalance, then the more there is public comment about the need to right size and perhaps how, the more it helps shape the willingness of parties to come to the table consensually. So I think it's a very constructive thing of what's going on here in New York. It may not be the ultimate step, but it's a necessary first step, that something that needs to happen. And
it, it's very easy or relatively easy for the three of us to talk about some of these issues, because we're not elected officials. What was incredible about the prior panel was that they were elected officials talking about these very issues, and in a room where the press is here. This is it's an event sponsored by an organization that puts material out there publicly, and it's very difficult to have these kind of conversations if you're an elected official in New York City, New York State, or anywhere around the country where there's a major media market that likes to get quotes and people to say things that will get ratings, or sell newspapers or sell magazines, and not to defend them, but it's not easy for politicians to start to try to raise some of these issues. I mean, you heard Dick Ravitch speak earlier, and I've known Dick for a number of years, and well, he's a great public servant. When he ran for mayor, he couldn't get more than 3% of the vote.
The reason that it's difficult for political candidates and elected officials to have these conversations is that the voters do not have the understanding that they need to have. If you took 1,000 typical New Yorkers and assigned them the task of balancing the state budget or balancing any municipal budget, and gave them the freedom to rewrite provisions of law and practice at all levels, they would probably apply some common sense and come up with some fairly good solutions. It's difficult to do that when the great majority of the electorate really does not have the time and in some cases the interest to pay that level of attention. And so again, this is why we keep coming back, at least in the Comptroller's office, to the need to educate the people as a major part of the solution.
Well, going back to the bankruptcy issue, I'm wondering if it did come to that in New York or even other parts of the country, are Wall Street investors untouchable?
No, well, no, they're going to play a material part. Actually, the fear of Wall Street is that if you're in City A and the players at the table are local unions with local workers and retirees, most of whom live in the neighborhood or thereabouts, and the third player is a group of bondholders that are institutionally held, or who knows who they are, but they're not here locally, that somehow there's going to be a notion that there's going to be more imposition on the credit markets than there are on those who are local. And I mean, that's a legitimate fear. On the other hand, there's a countervailing tension, which is whether you're a state or major cities in the state, to the extent you try to disproportionately push the concessions on the credit markets because they're not there locally, there's a pushback because there's credit costs for other cities and the state. And if you talk to the insurers and those who are in the municipal bond side, issuers and underwriters, they're saying that if you start being inhospitable and unfairly burdening to them, it's going to drive the cost of finance up for cities that are otherwise healthy or for the state. So there's that tension that goes on back and forth. Unquestionably, they're part of the dialogue. I mean, you've seen in the recent days, I mean, they're talking about 10 cents on the dollar to creditors, including the bondholders in Detroit. I mean, that's an extraordinary number. I don't know whether it's anywhere close to what will ultimately happen, not for me to comment today, but it is to say that there's no one is saying those can't be touched. And there is a considerable theory that just because you've had a, quote, full faith and credit pledge, that it means anything. If you talk to most bankruptcy judges, I was just on a panel in Orange County with two judges, one who had the Vallejo case and the other who had the Orange County case. I think their wisdom is it's an unsecured creditor obligation, unless it's a secured loan, specifically with certain tax revenue allocations to it. It's an unsecured obligation, so they're going to be at the table. And really, the issue, as far as I see it, is that all parties have to be. And so one of the issues that's happening in California, and it's really a bellwether issue, is what about the pensioners? Because there's a constitutional provision in California, not atypical, a lot of states have it, that says, listen, our public workers are constitutionally protected with regard to their vested retirement benefits. So that's the notion that CalPERS is asserting in California. The other creditors are saying, specifically the monoline insurers who have the first line of obligation on those bonds, are saying, why is that sacred? If this is in bankruptcy, then you basically take the benefit and the burdens of bankruptcy. If the city has chosen to go in, whatever state law is yields to the bankruptcy, and in bankruptcy, there's supposed to be, quote, a fair and equitable and ratably balanced distribution of pain among the various constituencies. So that issue is going to get decided ultimately in the California in federal courts in California. If you ask me to bet, I would say that the federal policy of uniform bankruptcy and the fact that they can control in a bankruptcy is going to dominate over the state 10th Amendment vested rights of the states to control. And when that, and then all the players are there at the table. What's the right answer once all the players are there as to how much pain one's supposed to get versus the other is uncertain. It doesn't mean that you have to go then into bankruptcy in order to get that protection, because again, as long as that's the view of the law and seems to be the norm, then when you go out and start talking to retiree providers or retiree groups themselves, they know the prospect that that could perhaps happen in BK, in which case they sit there and then negotiate from the perspective that that could possibly happen. So in my view, there has to be open season. There can be no sacred cows. Everybody has to share. The devil in the detail as to how much each group shares, and balancing that out in a rational way is the kind of thing that leadership by cities here in New York, I think, can play an important role in fashioning. And I wanted to just echo one other thing when Mayor Minor talked about the fact that as an elected official, they're not going to kick the can now. I think that's the beauty of it, is that you have leadership here in this state and in other places now that has totally changed from where it was 15 years ago, when you had property taxes constantly rising and you could basically fill the gaps by 10% raise in property tax. It's easy to have a 1% increase or 2% increase in property tax if the values are going up, by 10%. We don't have that any longer. It's just the opposite. And so taking a disciplined approach to saying this is a reality and doing it early and being explicit about it and saying I'm here to solve this, not kick the can, I applaud. And that's a strength that the state has, I think, among a lot of the leadership at the local and county level, to wanting to be proactive about it and not continue on the past which got us there for whatever reason, without blame or anything else. Fix it now.
And then, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Ward, any other advice you would give to the state or municipalities dealing with this?
The more the issue gets talked about, the better off everybody is. It's at that level, it's very simple, and not to be repetitive, but the fact that these conversations are going on is incredible, and we're going to have the ability to watch what happens in Stockton and react to it. And I think that is going to be helpful, and back to the earlier point of learning the lessons from the '75 fiscal crisis in New York City, aside from the fact that the state created a control board and helped to bail out the city at the time, it actually also took all those various players of bondholders and pensioners and labor unions all in the same room helping to deal with the issue, and that is how things get done at the end of the day.
I think one of the other things that sets New York City apart from pretty much all the rest of the state, or most jurisdictions around the country, is that not only is there a well-established body of laws and governmental institutions, but there's also a very strong civic element that has that pays attention to the city's fiscal condition. And I think of the Citizens Budget Commission, the Manhattan Institute, a number of other entities, and we don't have those kinds of entities in most other jurisdictions. Of course, New York City is unique in many ways, but I think it would be a very salutary thing if in some of the other troubled jurisdictions around the state that these sort of civic interest groups arose and started paying attention in the way that we see it happen in New York City.
All right, I think that's the end of our session. Thanks to our panelists.
I'd like to introduce the former mayor of Washington, D.C., Anthony Williams. He is also a member of the McKenna Long's Municipal Reform and Innovation Practice. He's going to give brief remarks, and then we're going to do a coffee break before the final session.
Good morning, everyone. I think someone's got a relative who's in the boom business or something, a lot of boom mics. Anyway, So as a self-respecting politician, I've been given, I feel like a mayor. I'm between you and lunch or you and something good. Been given 15 minutes, so I'll speak for 50 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. But 15 minutes. And I want to take the 15 minutes of time that I have to kind of like reflect on the little I've heard and my understanding of the agenda from my position. And I want to start off by kind of just restating my own bona fides and clarify them a little bit. Then some observations of where I think cities are in upstate New York, for example, based on my reading, based on conversations with leaders up there. I know Controller DiNapoli invited me a couple years ago to speak to upstate financial leadership up at Cornell. So just my kind of understanding of that and a way forward in the midst of all of this. So just some bona fides. So if I told you that, my experience as an elected official in Washington, D.C. began with my experience in Washington, D.C. During the control period of Washington, which would be analogous to the control period in New York City and Philadelphia and Cleveland. I served as the CFO under the presidentially appointed control board and really acted kind of really practically de facto as a kind of trustee of the situation, receiver of the situation, managing the finances of the city, pretty much almost tantamount running the city. At the time we took over the city, we had a financial problem, we had a governing problem, we had a whole lot of problems. As I used to state it to the people in Washington, D.C., it would be analogous to an overloaded, badly driven car on a bad road was our situation. We were badly driven. Marion Barry was mayor. I rest my case on that. We were overloaded. We pretty much promised everything to everybody. We are on a bad road in that it's tough being a city. You've heard this earlier today. And we were underpowered in that, like many cities, there were circumstantial, constitutional, structural restraints on what we could do. So when I started out, we inherited, for example, a cumulative fund deficit of about $500 million. We had a serious, bona fide junk bond rating. Pretty much nothing in the city worked. When I left in 2007, we had a cumulative fund balance of about $1.6 billion. We had cash reserves equal to pretty much the best in the country on a per capita basis as a jurisdiction, approaching and have just gone through the last couple of years, investment, I think AAA, AA rating. So we've come a long way. I would argue farther and faster than many jurisdictions our size. Now, there have been a number of reports. For example, most recently, New York Times did a story on Washington, D.C. Said, well, Washington, D.C., it's pretty much the federal government started spending money. That's why Washington, D.C. is doing well. Well, you know what? The federal government's been spending money for 200 years, and in 1993, we were in the situation we were in. So it's not simply the federal government spending money that got us in the position we are in. Certainly, circumstances improved, but we had to position ourselves to take advantage of those improved circumstances. Likewise, a lot of the things that we were able to do in Washington, D.C. really weren't limited to, or in some cases, they really weren't fundamentally about the government. They really were doing something I'm going to share with you, and that is, I think, looking at a larger role for city leadership in a time of crisis. And also understand that a lot of the situation that we face in Washington, D.C. is similar to the situation of cities in upstate New York. I'll give you a couple of examples. Federal policies that really underpower, as I said earlier, or disenfranchise cities prevailed in Washington, D.C. They prevailed in upstate New York. We talk about transportation policy, housing policy, racial distancing. There was an article in, I think, the Wall Street Journal or one of the major papers about 6 months ago about water usage in the West, that the drought you're seeing in the West is really a moderate to light drought when you overlay climate change. We won't get into an argument about global warming, but when you overlay climate change, you're facing serious water threats in the West writ large. Now, you could argue, is pricing of water really commensurate with the real challenge of that resource in the West? No. And it's the kind of mispricing, misallocation of resources over time that really has, I think, impaired the fortunes of cities in the Mid-Atlantic and certainly cities in New York State. I'd also say that we're similar in the sense that the future, I would say the future for the United States is bullish. I actually believe this. I actually think that healthcare costs, the way they are, energy independence, the fact that we're actually, despite our best efforts, actually plotting our way to some progress on the budget are all good signs. And so I think there actually is a prospect of an improved financial outlook, economic outlook for cities in states like New York. What's fundamental to this? I think what's fundamental to this is for cities to understand that I think the recovery in all the cities I've mentioned, whether it's Cleveland or a Philadelphia or a New York, and in my case, Washington, D.C., there was a government leader involved, and that government leader had to take bold steps to confront brutal reality. Sometimes it involved layoffs. A lot of times it involved right-sizing and recalibrating and rebalancing government agencies. But above and beyond all of that, it really was about improving the economy. And what are the steps that are really necessary to create a climate of investment, an environment of success to rebuild the economy in a city? And I think it can be done. I think it can be done by looking at a couple of different things. One, it can be done by the city leader understanding that his or her role in running the government is important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And what do I mean by that? It's important to run your government well and do the blocking and tackling well and manage your budget well, not as an end of itself, but to have the stature and respect so that then you can act as a convener of your business leadership, your non-governmental leadership, your business, your labor, your clerical, your secular. All of these are part of a network that you preside over as leader of your city if you're doing that blocking and tackling well. So what do I mean by that? If you're not answering the phones, if the government agencies aren't running well, if there's no real respect for the services in the city or public safety in the city, no one's going to expect you to lead on anything. But if you're doing those basic things well, then you can isolate one or two or three things that are going to be your key initiatives in moving your city forward. So let's take an example of education. Everyone would agree that key to rebuilding a city, key to rebuilding an economy is having a skilled, able workforce. Instrumental in driving that is having better education. Education is on the way to improvement in Washington, D.C., not limited to what the government is doing, but because we brought together non-governmental players, the religious community, business and labor on a reform agenda. And that's the mayor setting the tone, mayor improving that agenda. Another example, working through impairments I would give you is, we spend a lot of time in our city complaining about the fact that in our city we couldn't tax the visitors to the malls. You know, people come to the National Mall, 15, 16, 19 million people. You know, now I think it's over 20 million people coming to the mall. We can't tax these people who come to the mall. So my attitude was we can continue to kind of have meetings about it and complain about it to the federal government, or what we could do is we could bring together all the different parties I talked about, leadership of the city, develop a downtown plan to draw people off of the mall into the downtown where they can enjoy what our city has to offer, have a good time, and not to be self-interested. I can tax them. So our sales taxes improved dramatically because we brought together the business leadership to improve that stream of revenue. Another example, we don't have a commuter tax in Washington, D.C. People spend a lot of time complaining about lack of a commuter tax. I could go to a lot of meetings and complain about that, but I said, you know what we're going to do? Bring the city leadership together, focus on one or two or three things that are going to improve the quality of life in the city, send a signal that we're doing that, invite people to come back and live in Washington, D.C. People coming back to live in the city. It's improving our revenues, our income tax. Again, they're having the kind of quality of life that they expect because services have improved, crime's gone down. So I like that. They're having a good time. And again, not to be self-interested. I'm getting 9% off the top, income tax. That's all revenue coming in because we had a problem. Yes, we had a structural constraint, but we had created a network of resources to build a campaign, build a strategy to affect a change and realize a real outcome around that. You know, I think a couple observations about some of the steps that have been taken here in New York as it relates to the governor's plan. I think the notion of having a state task force that's addressed to the needs of cities in and of itself is a good thing. The state, anytime the state's paying attention to the needs of cities, I think that's a good thing. Anytime the state is spending time and attention on trying to create a better dashboard to manage the needs of cities and to try to address some of their problems and some of their challenges, I think is a good thing as well. The amount of information we share among ourselves at a city level is still at a primitive stage, I would argue. We have a lot of conventions, we have a lot of conferences, but we still all spend the same amount of money to do the same kind of basic things as opposed to sharing knowledge with one another and then hiring consultants when we hire consultants to do higher order things. I would argue the business community has figured that out. We need to figure that out, and if the state intervention is providing a platform for building a canon, a set of playbooks in a knowledge base, that's a really good thing. If the state intervention is going to mean that there are better rules for arbitration and better rules for deal, and what we're really talking about here, and you heard this from our previous panel, there's a huge tension now between retirees and current services. Retirees, current services, and paying for those services and making the trade-offs to provide the services that provide the quality of life that make your city vibrant. Anytime you can provide level playing rules to make that happen, that's a good thing. But you still need, ultimately, an investment strategy, because I would say you can't cut your way to prosperity. Cutting is sometimes essential, but you need an investment strategy. What if some of our strategy, and we don't have the luxury of simply doing this on a command and control basis. One, the federal government doesn't have the money, and two, it couldn't do it anyway. You know, I remember going to China on a couple visits, and we always complain in Washington, D.C. about our lack of voting rights, which I'm not making the subject of my remarks here, although I would like to point that out. We don't have any voting rights. We were in China. We were talking to some officials in China about our lack of voting rights. I would go to Shanghai, I would talk about lack of voting rights, and I remember going to Beijing and Jialing and all these different cities, and I noticed that all the officials didn't really seem plussed at all by this, and then I realized they're looking at me saying, hey, look, nobody here votes, what's the problem? You know, when you think of nobody here votes, you see the article in the Times on Sunday, the national government of China decided that they're going to move over the next 20, did you see this? They're going to move basically the population of the United States to cities. Think about that. If you look back on our history and people like here, Robert Moses in Washington, D.C., model cities, urban renewal, all the different federal interventions, for better or worse, they were federal interventions. We're not going to see those interventions anymore. So what are the kind of catalytic steps or the ingredients and factors that cities can put in place in the absence of federal involvement, or certainly contemplating and inviting future federal involvement that can make that happen? I would say a couple of things. One, just because it's true that the worst P3 involves, let's say, taking the city hall and paying too much for sale leaseback of the city hall and then using all the money for a party, right? Just because that's a horrible use of a P3 doesn't mean that all P3s are bad, and there's still an abiding, prevailing belief among government officials that all private equity involvement in government transactions, all kind of public-private participation is a bad thing. I think to move forward in a successful strategy, we have to once again realize again that government leadership is just part of an ensemble of factors that move your city forward, and that there are P3 projects that are economically feasible, politically defensible, especially when you consider the full life cycle costs of maintaining an asset. We've been told by GASB, record your assets, depreciate your assets, record the capital maintenance requirements of these assets, right? Okay, so if we think about all of this, we think of the full life cycle cost of these assets, and then if we think of balancing long-term gain, long-term benefit with long-term expenditure, then it makes sense for these public-private partnerships. But if we're talking about, yes, taking all the parking meters, and I don't mean to criticize any one transaction, but one comes to mind, taking the parking meters, monetizing parking stream revenue, but then using it to plug this year's budget, then that's hard to sell. But just because that's hard to sell doesn't mean that all public-private partnerships ought to be looked at askance, especially when, with all the turbulence and all the commotion in the public debt markets happening, debt costs may go up. I think it makes sense to give these a harder look as part of a strategy for our city, for our cities. So whether you're talking about public-private partnerships or whether you're talking about state intervention, I actually think that the future for our cities, if we look at what we can do ourselves, what we can leverage ourselves with the resources we have, is actually quite bright. And I'll close with this one story, because it is somewhat apropos in that you're talking about, here we're talking about, the quote-unquote Rust Belt. Pittsburgh, spectacular example with the Rust Belt. I actually went to visit Pittsburgh because I am involved with an organization called the Federal City Council, which is a business leadership of Washington, D.C. on big projects. And our antecedent was the Allegheny Conference in Pittsburgh. So I went to talk to all the people in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, prosperous city, great American city. We all know Pittsburgh, beautiful city actually. Well, what happened in 1986? Steel industry, right, imploded, foreign competition, global competition, steel industry imploded. What happened? Business leadership stepped up. Jim Rohr, PNC Bank, took a leadership role. Paul O'Neill at Alcoa brought the leadership of the city together on a focused strategy for the city. What was involved in that? One, it was coordinating the business leadership so everybody had a role in business leadership and there wasn't duplication and needless complications. So there was a regional focus, a local Chamber of Commerce focus, and a broad kind of civic focus. Organize a philanthropic leadership around key goals in the city, whether they were education or business reinvestment, and very, very importantly, bringing in the university community. In the case of Pittsburgh, it was Carnegie Mellon and Pitt. And what's happened? Well, the city isn't, the Eden that all of us would like our cities to be, it's come a long way from where it was in the 80s because of this kind of network that I'm talking about that can be instrumental in building a forward strategy in economic change and prosperity to really fundamentally and at bottom address the concerns that we're about today. So thank you for sharing those comments with you. Be happy to talk with you during the rest of the program. Thank you very much.